by the way? Apparently, there's some good interest in Ukraine. Thank you all for coming.
I think anybody will all notice that enter this building, that violin is not such a discourse, but I don't think.
Okay. You know, we've got I would say, a critical mass here, so we're going to start off. Welcome. Thank you for coming this evening. Very pleased that we're able to do this program with Dr. Mary Curtin, who I will introduce in a bit. Um, I encourage everyone to use the chat, which is in the lower part of your screen, to let us know where you are. And if you have questions or comments during the presentation, please put them there. And we will also be doing a Q&A at the end, and we'll be taking questions through the chat. And Charlie, I hope you'll synthesize these questions with me so that we can, lump group ones that are maybe similar and keep it going on a nice basis. Um, we'll be recording the meeting. We're also going to have a transcript of the meeting, so we'll send those things out to you once it's finished, probably tomorrow, perhaps the next day. Um, we have some interactive things built in, or one interactive thing, which was after Dr. Curtin's presentation, we're going to have a short breakout group in triads where we'll get to just chat with one another for 6 minutes, do a brief introduction of who you are and perhaps an observation of what you experienced during the presentation or what you're thinking about. Think of this as kind of like after meeting, just connecting with a couple of friends as you go on your way to the next thing. Not meant to be anything more than a brief introduction and get a little personal information on those that we're working with tonight or here with tonight. We will also have a poll after Dr. Curtin's presentation. We'll see kind of what some of the attitudes are about Ukraine and what might happen. And so a couple of things. We are the United Nations Association of Minnesota. We're part of a national organization, the United Nations Association of the USA. We are dedicated to educating, inspiring, and mobilizing Minnesotans to support the principles and vital work of the United Nations and its agencies. We were formed somewhere just before or just after the UN in 1945. Our historical records are a little either missing or hard to track, and of course the original members are alas no longer present with us. So it's a long-standing organization, as is the United Nations Association of the USA. Been in around since that same time, and I will say that once upon a time, Eleanor Roosevelt volunteered to stomp the country on behalf of the United Nations Association and build our membership. It was a different era. People were enthused and excited about the UN, and she built our membership very, very well. If you'd like to become a member of the United Nations Association, which I encourage you to do so, please go to the www.una.usa and look for a tab that's Get Involved, and you'll see it's easy to join. First year membership is $25. If you're a student under 26, it's free. And so, and you'll I think, be pleasantly surprised how much good information and materials and programs that we all have, both nationally and locally. So please join us. The national organization, UNA USA, is holding their annual Global Engagement Summit, which typically at the UN, generally before our era that we're in now, would have 500 or 600 attendees going to New York to hear top flight people from the UN talk about the topics of the day. This year it's going to be virtual. It's on February 24th from 12 in the afternoon to 4 in the afternoon, and you can register for that on the national website. Again, it's www.unausa. These are very good programs. The topic of this year's is One Humanity, One Planet, One Common Agenda. Going back to the United Nations Association of Minnesota just for a second, we have three major programs. We have the Model UN program, which has been in place since 2004. We've served over 27,000 senior and junior high students with our Model UN program. We have programming, of which this is one. We'll do 8 or 10 programs a year on timely subjects or subjects devoted to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, also known as Agenda 2030. And our last program that we do is advocacy in support of telling our elected officials and others the importance of the UN and asking for support for what we're doing. So with that, I'm just going to do a little brief introduction. We're all here tonight because we're curious about Ukraine, trying to understand more. We have very many opinions and many hands in the pot, as it will, right? Everywhere you go, you can see something slightly different about what the outcomes might be or who's doing what or what the history has been. And so that's why we're here. If Russia invades, what will it gain? Will it be something like a regime change, or will it look like Afghanistan? What role does the UN, what role do international agencies have in it? Dr. Curtin is going to address this. So I'm very pleased that we're able to do this. I'm going to now introduce Dr. Mary Curtin, who's a diplomat in residence and chair of the Global Policy Area at Humphrey School of Public Affairs. During Dr. Curtin's foreign service career, she served as the U.S. mission to the EU in Brussels, as political counselor in Warsaw, Poland, at the missions in Tunisia, Mali, and Chile. Very wide berth of things, as well as in Washington, D.C. Dr. Curtin has an expertise in issues including European affairs, the EU and NATO, Middle Eastern policy, human rights, democratization, and non-proliferation, which is another whole topic unto itself. Dr. Curtin was a member of the U.S. delegation to the 1995 Beijing Conference on Women. During her time in Warsaw, which is 2004 to 2008, and Brussels, 2008 to 11, Dr. Curtin engaged in joint U.S.-Polish and U.S.-EU responses to the tensions in Russia, over Ukraine and Georgia, and in support of Ukraine's development as an independent democracy. Dr. Curtin earned a PhD in history from Columbia. Her dissertation was on Hubert H. Humphrey and the politics of the Cold War, 1943 to 54. Dr. Curtin has a master's in security studies from the U.S. Army War College, obtained in 2003, and a BA from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Curtin speaks French, Polish, and Spanish. So we welcome Dr. Mary Curtin, and thank you for coming tonight and talking with us about Ukraine. Please, it's your platform.
Great. Thank you, Stu, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. It's a little daunting to speak to such a large group of people, many of whom I'm sure have some of your own knowledge or experience or attachments to the region that we're going to be talking about tonight. And I will do my best to do it justice and understand that it will be hard to cover all the possible issues. We could do a whole separate conversation about nuclear non-proliferation, and Ukraine would be at the center of it, right? And so I'm really happy to see so many people here this evening. One thing that Stu didn't mention that I don't even know if I told him is that I grew up here in the Twin Cities in St. Paul. And as I always say, all I ever wanted to do when I was growing up was leave. And then as I went along in my career, I realized, you know, what a really great and especially what a really internationally engaged community we have here in the Twin Cities. And organizations like the UN Association of Minnesota or Global Minnesota are just a couple of the many organizations here that, that are evidence of the interest in the people of the Twin Cities in understanding and being and thinking about and engaging in the important issues of the day. And I'm particularly pleased to be speaking to this organization. I know by the very fact that you're here this evening that you place importance on the role of the United Nations in addressing some of the most important issues that face our world. And despite the weaknesses and the difficulties in sometimes how the United Nations operates, which we're going to talk about a little bit tonight, it is a really important organization for bringing countries together to at least try to solve some of those critical issues, whether it is issues of war and peace, issues about climate, poverty, all the other issues that face us. It occurred to me that while I was preparing for this, that we are very close to the 8th anniversary of Russia's seizing of Crimea and instigation of a conflict in the eastern Ukrainian province of Donbass. And I think it's important, and I will try to do that tonight, to remember that there are people living this reality, especially in Donbass, and that words that we use to try to explain this, including things like low-level conflict, are not low level for the people who live there and whose lives have been disrupted by the conflict that continues in that region. And so I think it's important, as we also think about how we address this issue, you know, to remember that this is also a part of the world that has endured some of the most horrific conflicts, especially during World War II, that we have seen. So I'm going to, I have made a few mostly sort of map-based slides that I'm going to have up that I think, that I hope will help in thinking about Ukraine and what we're talking about. And maybe we can start by just having a little recap of where we are now in the world. So this is Ukraine, and we'll come back to the general map. This one I had a hard time opening, so I'm going to just move over to this article because I couldn't copy this over. So we have seen a lot of news. This is a bigger picture of Ukraine. This is Russia. This area here is Donbass area where this conflict continues. And these are the reports of Russian troops that are massing on the border with Ukraine, not just in that area, but also up toward Belarus, which is something that is of particular concern to some of the countries in the region. There are currently estimated by Western countries, including the United States, to be around 100,000 Russian troops in these various formations. This is in addition to and separate from the irregular forces, some of whom may or may not be members of the Russian military, who have been engaged in this conflict that is ongoing in this region. So, go back to this slide. In response, the United States and NATO allies have begun positioning troops in greater numbers in countries that are next to Ukraine, in addition to pre-existing troops that were already there. When this crisis, the current phase of the crisis, erupted in the end of 2021, which is when Stu called and asked me if I could talk about this. Since that time, since December, throughout January, there have been from both sides warnings about there have been warnings from the US and its allies, warnings about an imminent Russian invasion. There have been denials from the Russians that they are going to do that. And at the same time, angry words about the presence of the US troops and the proximity of NATO to Russia and its borders. And there was at one point such alarm that even Ukraine, which was asking for assistance, asked the United States to publicly ask that the United States to tone its rhetoric down as it was causing panic in the country. We have heard many things from US leaders, including both that the United States would not send troops to fight, but that we would send equipment and training to Ukraine, that we would sanction Russia and potentially Putin himself if Russia mounts a new invasion of Ukraine. We have seen, for those of you who are on Twitter, battles over what policy is and should be, over whose fault all of this is. And we have seen this week a flurry of the latest round of diplomacy that involved French President Macron going to Russia and then to Ukraine. And I heard today that President Biden received a report out from him. And so that's the sort of crisis mode where we are right now. I was really trying to think through, like, what are the reasons given for why Putin would have chosen this moment to mass those troops there. And I think that I finally gave up on that. I think we could spend an entire hour just speculating on why that is happening. But it is happening, and it has a long historical background. But before we go any further than that, I really do want to center Ukraine in this, because one of the problems with this issue and one of the realities that Ukraine has endured for centuries is that it has rarely been able to be fully in charge of its own destiny. And that is, to me, one of the real core problems in what we're talking about. Ukraine is a large country. In landmass, it's second only to Russia in Europe. It's larger than France, it's larger than any other European country, with a population of more than 41 million, which makes it the 8th most populous country in Europe. It has rich agricultural land and an industrial base that was built during the Soviet era, but remains. Not to mention a really important geostrategic position that includes the Crimea territory, which other countries still recognize as Ukrainian territory, but also other coastal line along the Black Sea. Over the centuries, including in the 20th and 21st century, Ukraine has endured domination, division, and war at the hands of more powerful neighbors. This map here gives a sense of the different pieces of Ukrainian territory that previously did not belong to it. And if you went back even further, you would see some of these pieces of territory belonging to different empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The yellow part belonged to Poland until World War II. And these things have really important impacts on Ukrainian culture and politics. So this is a little fuzzy and I apologize for that, but it gives a sense of how the history of Ukraine has impacted the languages, and along with language, the sense of culture and the sense of unity in the country. So the dark red areas and the darkest red areas are the ones that are dominated by or are heavily populated by Russian speakers. And obviously then in the western part of the country that was part of Poland until World War II, you have far fewer Russian speakers. Some of those Russian speakers are Russians with an affiliation to Russia who migrated there during the time of the Soviet Union. Others, and this is where it gets really complicated, are Ukrainians who speak Russian, but who identify as Ukrainian and who feel culturally and politically attached to Ukraine. And so this long history is one issue that we often hear Vladimir Putin raise. He accurately describes the area that we now know as Ukraine as sort of the cultural origin of the Russian people. But the reality historically also is that over time, the Russian people, the center of culture of the Russian people migrated north and east to what we now know as Moscow. And the area that we now know as Ukraine developed its own language and cultural identity with a great diversity of religion, including Catholic and Orthodox Christians, not to mention large Muslim populations, especially in Crimea, and until World War II and the Holocaust, large Jewish populations throughout. In the wake of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Ukrainians declared an independent republic, and in January 1918, a precursor to modern Ukraine, which I think would be in this green area, a precursor to modern Ukraine became independent. However, the Soviet Union almost immediately began to try to subdue and take over that territory. And by 1925, had essentially gained control. That said, and this is something to think about, and that is discussed a lot in terms of thinking about what would happen if Russia launched a full-scale invasion, and I think that's a good word to use, is that when the Soviet Union attempted to subdue Ukraine, there was considerable conflict and resistance. And I think, as many of you probably know, the Soviet Union imposed such harsh restrictions that Ukraine endured one of the most horrific famines of the 20th century, in which millions of people died. And that history is important to Ukrainians and impacts how they think about their current country and how they think about their relationships with both Russia and the rest of Europe. Once World War II broke out, the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, which was the green area, for a time was not directly impacted. But then when Hitler invaded, Ukraine was the route through which that went. Many Ukrainians, because of the harsh realities that they had lived under in the 20s and 30s under Soviet rule, joined in with the Nazi forces. And that, again, is another area of really significant controversy that impacts, in particular, relationships between Western and Eastern Ukraine, and also is a political thing that you will hear Putin and other Russians bring up a lot, arguing that the current government of Ukraine, for example, is an inheritor of the World War II era partisans that aligned with Nazi Germany. And so it's almost like at each step, you can see issues in Ukraine's history that are important not only to Ukraine, but also to Russia and to some of the other countries. So that said, after World War II, Ukraine became an important part, really an important part of the Soviet Union. And like I said, it was not only an important agricultural area. The Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy was based in the Crimean Peninsula and still is. And Russia moved a lot of industry into Ukraine. The lip service that was given by Russia to this supposed autonomy or independence of Ukraine extended in a political deal with the US to Ukraine having separate membership in the UN, and included in 1954 the Soviet Union gifting Crimea to Ukraine. So during that time, like I said, also, there were many Russians who moved from Russia into the Ukrainian part of the USSR, and many of those people remained behind. So the problems that we are dealing with today began to emerge, obviously, at the end of the Cold War. And in addition, the disputed history of what happened next is very much alive and is very real to Vladimir Putin, for starters, who talks all the time about deals that may or may not have been made or agreed to by the United States and other countries as the Cold War ended, and especially as NATO and the EU expanded eastward. So with the end of the Cold War and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously you have the emergence of several countries that became independent countries, but whose full autonomy, in most cases, Russia did not really recognize. And the other thing that I'm going to point out right here, this little orange spot right there, which is Kaliningrad, was previously East Prussia. In all of the border shifts that were sort of engineered in the run-up to and during World War II, first between Stalin and Hitler, and subsequently in agreements that ended the war, that little piece of what was formerly Germany remained with Russia, and it remains there today. So when you hear about these missiles that the Russians have, that is an area of great concern to other NATO allies. So the collapse of the Soviet Union led Ukraine in 1991 to its first full real period of full independence, even if it was under Russian domination in a lot of ways. One of the most interesting things is that it also left Ukraine as a large military power, as a lot of the Soviet military remained in Ukraine, including a large arsenal of nuclear weapons. And so during the period of the 1990s, that looked like a period when Russia and the United States and other countries could work out the path forward in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The United States, Russia, and a number of other countries signed what was called the 1994 Budapest Declaration, which again, you hear that talked about a lot, in which Ukraine agreed to give up all of its nuclear weapons in return for recognition of its sovereignty, and that word was used by both the United States, Russia, and all other countries. There was a considerable amount of money put into this project by the United States to help Ukraine and subsequently other countries in Central Asia dismantle and decommission their nuclear weapons that they had inherited from the Soviet Union. But this period left Ukraine not only sort of dominated by Russia, but it also left Ukraine very divided. There were differences of opinion within Ukraine that persisted in the 90s and on into the early 2000s over whether or not Ukraine should retain its close relationship with Russia or seek a closer relationship with the ever-expanding EU and NATO. And I think it's important to recognize that within Ukraine itself, there have always been differences over the path forward for Ukraine. So the real change in Ukraine began in 2004. In summer of 2004, I was getting ready to go to Poland. And I remember getting a briefing by the Ukraine desk officer. And she said to me, you know, there's two big issues out there. One are the elections that will take place in Ukraine this fall. And, you know, we're urging them to be fair elections, but we would be surprised if they were. And the other is that the Russian lease on Crimea will be coming up in, I think it was at that point in 8 years. And she said, that's a potential flashpoint. And I sort of filed that away in the back of my head and didn't really expect much to happen. But by the end of that year, Ukraine was in the midst of the Orange Revolution, and countries in the region, especially Poland, were very, very, very involved in trying to make that, that election, which no one expected to be fair, to have an outcome that reflected what appeared to be the majority will of Ukrainian people, which was to elect a president who was more West-leaning than Russian-leaning. And this is sort of the beginning of the problem of where the crisis today starts. In the lead up to 2004, 2004 is also the year when many countries like Poland joined the European Union. I'm just going to let this little one run. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there were a lot of discussions between the United States and Russia over how to oversee the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact countries, the withdrawal of Soviet Union troops eastward. And as part of those discussions, there were at times guarantees floated by the United States, and the Russians would say guarantees given by the United States. And there's a lot of really interesting debate over what actually happened, over whether or not, we're going to go right here, whether or not NATO would, there's a great new book out called Not 1 Inch, because Russia says that American leaders promised that NATO would not move 1 inch east of where it was at that time. The United States and others say, you know, that was part of the discussion, but we never gave the guarantees. The problem is that countries like the Baltics and Poland and some of the other countries wanted to be part of NATO because they did not feel secure. The other thing that those countries did that I think is really important and sometimes gets lost is that they also wanted to join the European Union. And the United States worked with the European Union and NATO to create plans so that these countries would join not just NATO, but also the EU. And that was in alignment with the idea that those institutions work hand in hand, even though they have slightly different membership, to create the kind of stability that Europe itself did not know until the end of World War II. Russia argues that these two organizations are two sides of the same coin of Western encroachment on Russia's sphere of influence. This is Belarus, that's Ukraine, right? And this is Kaliningrad. So this eastward movement of NATO and the EU, so that in 2004, suddenly you have new countries that had already joined NATO. So this is the NATO expansion are now also joining the EU. And then at the end of 2004, there was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. I think this is a real turning point for Vladimir Putin. I think that he already had, in his early days in power, really had come to power with the idea, as he always says, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, and that Russia deserves a sphere of influence, that the EU and NATO are, the US sort of aggressive designs, an intention to encircle Russia. And I think that this conflict that we have today sort of emerges out of that. I think that there's a lot of really valid discussion to be had about whether or not the rapid eastward movement of NATO, along with the EU, but especially NATO, was a good idea. And what's really interesting, I saw something just yesterday, a declassified cable from the US Embassy in Moscow in 1994, I think it was, from Ambassador Tom Pickering, saying that the speed of NATO expansion is creating pushback in Russia, and that it was going to create problems. And it appears that there were quite a few people who were saying that quietly behind the scenes, in addition to those who were saying that more loudly. So after the 2004 Orange Revolution, Ukraine went through a period from 2004 to 2014, really, in which there were elections, in which there were leaders, some of whom leaned more west, others of whom were more aligned with Russia. There was also political turmoil within Ukraine over issues such as corruption. There was a lot of difference of opinion over whether or not Ukraine should try to join NATO. And in 2008, the leader of the country at that time asked to join NATO, but then that request was withdrawn after that. Nonetheless, even under a more pro-Russian leader, let me just go here, under the more pro-Russian leader who was president in 2013, Yanukovych, he sought not NATO membership, he withdrew the request for NATO membership, but he sought to join, and I apologize for how fuzzy this is, what became known as the Eastern Partnership, which is an EU, not a NATO, free trade agreement, because the EU also is not prepared to offer full membership yet to Ukraine. And it was the joining of this EU organization and not joining NATO that sparked Putin to push back against Yanukovych, to tell him to pull back from that partnership. And he did, and it led to street protests that eventually led him to flee the country, which then at the beginning of 2014 sparked the crisis that we are in now. And so one thing that I would like to emphasize is to remember that, that both European countries and Russia see the EU and NATO as really importantly linked institutions. When I was in Poland, certainly the Poles saw joining both of those institutions as critical to their integration into Europe, right? And so the question I do think is an interesting question out there is, what if only the EU had expanded and not NATO? And we don't know, but the fact that there was a clear policy of bringing countries into both organizations as part of broader programs after the end of the Cold War are I think really important, and I think there's some really interesting historians and political scientists out there who are examining this question that's there. So this is where the problem. This is the thing that sparked the current crisis. The demonstrations in the streets of the cities of Ukraine, demanding that Yanukovych leave. He left. And almost immediately after that is when Putin took over. So there's two separate things happened. They seized and claimed to annex Crimea, and they supported this irregular warfare in the Donbass region, where there is pro-Russian sentiments, right? In 2014, when that happened, there was urgent diplomacy that was Europe-based, that was sponsored by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is an organization we don't hear about a lot, with the support of France and Germany. So there is important precedence for France taking the kind of lead on, on seeking a resolution to this. And an agreement was made to create what's called a line of control with OSCE observers, one of whom is a recent graduate of our Master of Human Rights program, and who I talked to in December and told her to quit talking about Russia. And she is out there every day with other police observer units, inspecting violations along these various lines of control. And that continues. So I think it's really also important to know that despite this crisis, that these mechanisms that are set up by this international organization are ongoing. So, one thing that, and I'll come back to then where we are now. So since 2014, this uneasy peace and this, unfortunately, I hate the term low-level conflict, it has continued. There have been difficulties. So these gray zones that are agreed to as buffer zones are places where people live, right? And they live there, and there is conflict that continues there. And there has been this stalemate since 2014, the end of 2014, when this agreement was set up. And that agreement is in place, and it creates a space in which, oops, my fingers are too slippery here. It creates a space and ideas for how the current crisis potentially could be resolved. The United Nations, so finally I'll come to the United Nations. Many of you may have seen that the United Nations Security Council held a meeting on Ukraine last week. And any nation in the United Nations can ask the United Nations Security Council to hold a meeting if there is a concern that they have, which is what Ukraine has right now. Where the problem comes in, obviously, is that for the United Nations Security Council to take any action, all members of the Security Council, all the permanent 5 members have to, at the very least, abstain, if not support it, right? So obviously, Russia is going to veto any effort by the UN Security Council to take action on anything that Russia might be doing. So the idea of, can the UN get involved? It is virtually impossible for the UN to take any strong action, such as imposing sanctions on Russia or sending a peacekeeping force or anything else that is affirmative action that requires the P5 members to at least not veto it. But that said, the Secretary General or the Undersecretary for Political Affairs can and have been involved in diplomacy to try to get Russia to back down from what it is doing right now, and probably also to talk to some of the other countries about what they can do with regard to that. Where there has been, I would say, more success, as uneven and unsatisfactory as it has been, is in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That is an organization that was set up during the Cold War. It was set up specifically in order to create confidence building measures and try to deconflict some of the tensions between the East and the West, the Warsaw Pact and the NATO bloc. And it was reformulated and reconfigured after the end of the Cold War because it no longer made sense to operate the way that it had. But I think also, and I think it's a little unfortunate myself that there's been so much criticism of efforts by anyone else, including President Macron of France, to go to Russia and try to talk to Putin. I think that going to Russia and talking to Putin isn't allowing him to win or to to direct the future, but it recognizes that we have a problem and that the way to start solving the problem is for European leaders and not just the U.S. and have a role in seeking ways to reduce tensions in order to avoid war. Um, I I struggled a lot in preparing for this with how do you wrap this up? You know, what are the words of wisdom that any of us, I think, seek to have to say what would work and what would be a good idea. Um, m- my my conclusion, based on my experience and what I know, is that Vladimir Putin is not going to ever embrace the idea that the countries along Russia's borders have the sovereign right to make their own decisions. And I also think that the United States has had an unfortunate approach over the last 20 years of allowing sort of thoughts about what can we do militarily to lead in our foreign policy. And so I think that there are things that the United States and our allies in Europe can do. I'm personally of the opinion that maybe the president of Ukraine has a point in that, this constant talk about, imminent invasions and this and that. I mean, I think it's designed to deter, but it can also have the impact of raising a sort of panic, not just in Ukraine, but also expectations that somebody has to do something. And the thing about diplomacy, especially in difficult situations like this, is that it can be very unsatisfactory. It doesn't always have a clean and clear and happy ending. Sometimes good diplomacy just leads to worse things not happening. And maybe this is one of those cases. So maybe I'll end where I started, which is to say that I think that it's important to understand that that there are people whose lives are impacted by this, whose lives may not be helped by, and I'm an American, so I'm going to speak for what I think the United States should do, who may not be helped by by dismissing the efforts of, say, the French president or saying, we have to show we're tough, but that, continuing to do the hard work of diplomacy that I think we see being done. And obviously a lot of it happens behind the scenes where we don't hear about it or see it until, some result is reached. But I think that in complex situations like this, also there's always a complex array of organizations that each have a role to play, and that for all its faults, the OSCE and our European allies might be better placed than the United States to be out front in looking for a solution to this problem. So I am going to wrap up because I know that we are going to do, as Stu said, I'm going to let him explain how we're going to go into these little chat groups and then come back. And I am happy to take any question. And Stu also is going to be sending this out to you. I've put together a very short list of a couple of things that I think are really interesting to read. And they cover a couple of things. There's a brand new book by Mary Curtin that's based on recently declassified documents about the whole issue of the expansion of NATO. And it's really interesting. It has a sort of fresh take on that whole era, and that really informs what we're doing today. If if you're interested in Ukraine's history, Anne Applebaum's book Red Famine about the famine in Ukraine is very moving and I think really worth a read. I put the name Polina Ivanova here. I've seen some really interesting things that she's written in the Financial Times. If you're interested in sort of the US approach to the world, another history book, Stephen Wertheim, Tomorrow the World, looks at sort of the policy planners just before World War II and during World War II and how they viewed the US new role as we came out of World War II. And then a former Polish colleague has put together a huge volume that's available publicly that is the documents in which he seeks to demonstrate that how NATO tried, worked with Russia after the end of the Cold War. So I will finish up there, Stu, and I look forward to hearing your questions after the break.
Thank you, Mary. It's a wonderful presentation. So
which he seeks to demonstrate that how NATO tried worked with Russia after the end of the Cold War. So I will finish up there, Stu, and I look forward to hearing your questions after the break.
good. Okay, so thank you, Mary. It's a wonderful presentation. Somehow I've got some audio issues here. This is really strange.
Work with Russia after the end of the Cold War. So I will finish up there, Stu. And is someone playing? Could everyone please put their mics on mute?
Yeah, perhaps this will work now. Thank you, Mary. So we have a poll that captures some, but not all, of what Dr. Curtin spoke about. And then once we've kind of had a look at that, then we'll go into these breakout groups, and then we're going to come back to the Q&A. And I know that the questions and answers often are the richest part of a presentation. So please put your questions in chat. And if the chat bogs down, you could use your do a thumbs up or something, and we'll get to you as time allows. And we're going to finish at 8:30 this evening, and then stick around for a little bit in an more informal way if you'd like to just chat some more. So here comes the poll.
All right. Am I on here?
Somebody's on.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Uncommon Core lecture, the causes and consequences of the Ukraine crisis. My name is Michael Volchak. I attended the university from 1986 to 1991. I got a bachelor's in political science and a master's in international relations.
Where is that coming from?
Professor Mearsheimer was a tremendous influence on my life. Completely revolutionizing my worldview, changed how I looked at international relations, politics, just everything.
Who is this?
In fact, he was such a big influence in my life that, whoops, that when I went home for the summer between one of the school years, leaving my college girlfriend here, she gave me a little keepsake picture book, and she said, "Here, to remember the people you love."
Stu, do you have a web browser open that is doing this?
Yeah.
That's a true story.
Stu, it was your web browser for sure.
I don't know how that happened. I'm very sorry. Very interesting. Whoever that was, thank you for showing up. We might find out who that was and send that link out too after we figure it out a little bit. How did that ever happen? I have no idea. Anyway, I'm going to relaunch the poll, so please answer it. There's 4 questions.
I have a question about number 2. I can't answer that. I think none of the above, yes or no, are reasonable. We could be agnostic, don't know, as the third option, which I would recommend adding.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's too late, but that's a well-expressed thought.
Well, then I can't submit it without answering yes or no, and I won't do that.
Okay.
Too.
Thank you. So we've got 30 of 58 participants. So please, we'll keep the poll open for another minute or two just to see if we can gather more data, more information. Now we're clicking along. Thank you. Keep going. Okay, we'll keep it open for another 60 seconds. So we have 38 of 57 responding. And we know at least one person is not going to respond because of the question. Could have been better. And yes, the video, this is being recorded completely with the other presentation for 35 seconds. Okay, I'm going to.
People are finding it difficult to answer. It's because they don't have access to put in their responses.
Well, right. I'm going to end the poll here and then I'm going to share it. So question number 1, who is more of an aggressor, the United States or the Russian Federation, or about the same? So about the same or the Russian Federation carry the day on that question. Will Russia invade Ukraine? 54% thought yes. The 46% thought no, so that's inconclusive, really. If Russians invades, will it be full scale or an incursion? Most people by far thought of an incursion. If there's a major Russian invasion, how should the US respond? Very few people thought send troops and send arms. Of course, we are sending arms already in many ways. Impose harsh sanctions on Russia and Putin. Do both 2 and 3, that kind of carried the day, or do nothing. Oh, didn't actually carry the day, it came close. Do nothing to 2%, and take it to the United Nations, or as Mary talked about, the OSCE. So, seems like harsh sanctions and armament, but take it to really the OSCE, with keeping the UN pushing away in the background as it is able to do. So that's the poll. Okay, now we're going to do this thing called breakout groups. 6 minutes, just a time to chat and kind of exchange views on this and get to know each other a slight bit. And here we are. We're going to assign, let's see, there are 56 people, so 3 per. So we'll do 18. So so there will be more than 3 in some. And we will close this with 4 minutes left in the room. Lori, do you want to be in another room?
Oh, no, I don't really want to do a breakout.
How about Fred?
Somebody dropped out of the group I was in and then we,
Okay. Well, how are you? How's it going? What do you think?
I think it's very good. Really good.
Thank you. Always a few technical difficulties here.
Oh, it's the way of the world.
Yeah.
I just think it's fascinating that we have Kaliningrad. Did you know about Kaliningrad?
No.
That little finger stuck between Poland and
Yeah. No, I didn't. I didn't even know that. I never even heard of it before.
I haven't either.
I'm just going to send everyone a little message.
Okay.
Such an interesting topic, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and I hadn't heard any of the. I just all of that history was so valuable.
You know, one thing is I was on the United Nations Association board for many, many years with Tom Pickering, and I know him.
Oh yeah, I didn't know he was there.
Yeah, I wish that I'd had some sense to say, well, tell us about the negotiations you had with Russia when
Mhm.
it was all collapsing. And I wonder if he would remember me. I think he's still alive, isn't he? I haven't heard that he's not alive.
I'll look him up. He's at Brookings.
It'll be interesting to see what he has to say about all this.
He's not a youngster. He was born in 1931.
Yeah.
He's 90.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So he went to Bowdoin College.
Bowden, yeah. Where my ex-business partner went,
Oh yeah.
Clint Bear.
So is he out there doing nothing now?
I have no idea. He just stopped communicating with me.
Oh,
Weird. It's like, did I do something?
yeah.
I don't think so. I'd like to know because he's a smart, thoughtful guy, but I can't guess it. Okay, so
Didn't he move?
yeah, they're in. I think if I close all rooms, it takes 60 seconds or something to come back.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to close all the rooms in 13 seconds. I forgot to set up the time on this. That was the one thing. And plus, however did that guy come on the browser?
I don't know. Apparently, the Dr. Curtin knew the technology of of having a web browser in the background.
No, yeah, and Craig Neal suggested too.
Oh, yeah. Well, no doubt people who use Zoom a lot to give talks.
Well, yeah, they're the experts at it.
Yeah.
Hello, Gare.
People coming back.
Yep. We're all going to rush back here so soon because there'll be no choice.
You have such power.
I don't. Technology does in this instance. Well, I hope that was a good experience for you all, getting to chat with some people and a little different. Okay, well, welcome back. Now we have question time, and I will start looking at the chat. And
There was one question at the very top that said, historically, are there any historical factors in the region that would make the Russians especially sensitive to the idea of having hostile forces on their borders? And I would say that there may be a pretty straight up answer to that even in the last 100 years, but I mean, there's always been the historical thing that there's not a lot of mountain space, and anytime you're on the plains, you need space because you don't have natural barriers. But it's a question that could be a whole talk just of its own. I'm sure Mary has an easy answer, but
I don't think there's, I mean, I think that it is a talk in and of itself. I mean, I think that the historical way in which Russian culture and the Russian country grew, not to mention all of the sort of history of Europe. One thing that I think people forget is that Europe in and of itself, which is why there is so much concern within Europe about this whole easy talk, I think, about war, is that for Europeans, because they lived World War II and the United States, by and large, did not in the way that Europeans did. And I think there's a lot of caution within Europe still over easy talk around war. So Stu, is it okay if I go to some of the people who have their hands up?
please.
Let's see. I think Keith, you had yours up first. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, thank you, Mary, for an excellent presentation and well balanced. I guess my major concern is that, on the United States, in an election year now, there's going to be, showing any softness at all on this issue would be capitalized by the other side of the politics, and in a year at which the full House and Senate are at risk. So the question for you, I think, is kind of, you mentioned the OSCE, but it seems like there needs to be, as you said, some third party or some other party stepping forward to offering Putin some kind of semi-guarantees, at least for some immediate future, that Ukraine will not join NATO. So I guess, who might you see as that kind of party? And do you think there's any likelihood that somebody could do that? Could it be done informally or under the table as some of the secret agreements of the past, or is that unrealistic?
That is one of the questions that's one of the 80 things that I would have liked to have talked about, but didn't want to talk for 8 hours. So, the sad reality of this. So I talked about the fact that even within American foreign policy and political circles in the 90s, there was concern about the rapid expansion of NATO. But when the only sort of nod toward Ukraine that NATO has made was in 2008. And the United States and Poland and a couple of other countries at that time made a real hard push for a firm offer to be made to Georgia and Ukraine. But there has never been unity within NATO over the idea of expanding any further, and especially of bringing Ukraine and Georgia, which are seen as countries that are so unstable that they are not ready for NATO membership, and NATO is not ready to have them be members, to which other NATO members would be obligated under Article 5. And so the sad sort of irony is that that there is no plan within NATO to bring Ukraine in as a member, except for this sort of vague assurance that was made in 2008 that, Ukraine and Georgia would have a sort of prospect of joining NATO. And I think that we are in this sort of difficult situation right now, where anyone who would come out and say that then is seen to be weak as against Putin. There was a lot of consternation within NATO in 2008 when the Bush administration, Polish government, a couple others really pushed that idea. So I think that's a problem. How do you walk that back now that that idea has been put out there? So, and I'm going to just take one question from the chat from Alexander Newhauser about how Russia's possible invasion of Russia might change the dynamics among Finland and Sweden. So just as a reminder, Finland and Sweden are not members of NATO. They are members of the EU. They have been officially neutral since World War II. However, Sweden in particular in recent years has drawn much closer to NATO. And Sweden was, along with Poland, the country that came up with the idea of the Eastern Partnership Agreement to bring Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova into closer alliance with the EU, in part as a sort of substitute to NATO. And Finland it also has made some noises, I would say, that it would, if it felt threatened itself, because Finland was itself invaded by Russia or Soviet Union at that time, and a significant proportion of its territory taken. But there have been some, I would put them at the level of noises, that if in any way Finland was threatened, that it would reconsider that. So let's see, Jay, I think you had your hand up, Jay Shahidi.
Yes, Dr. Curtin, thank you for your enlightening and comprehensive report on or presentation on Ukraine. My concern is that I was a young person and college student during Vietnam War, and I see some ominous resemblance to the beginning of Vietnam War right now in Ukraine. And I would like to see what we all can do to avoid it, prevent it. We've had about 8 years of warfare right now, and it's getting worse. The question that I have for you is, how can we get rid of this bad blood between the leader of Russia, Mr. Putin, and the United States? And do you agree with me that the US took some wrong steps? For example, in 2014, your colleague, Assistant Secretary of State, told the US ambassador in Ukraine who to put in power as president. And a recording of it was sent to the world media. And before that, in 2006, our president put missiles in Poland and some other places of East Europe, which scared Vladimir Putin. How can we correct these and look at it a little bit in an empathetic way from their point of view and try to reduce the tensions?
So, and I will just note that there have been a couple of other comments or questions about U.S., the U.S. interference, U.S. missteps, and I would agree with you absolutely that the United States itself has made some serious mistakes, and we could have a very lengthy discussion on why the United States did those things. And there are, as some commenters have noted, there are some who interpret the whole program of the United States after the end of the Cold War, including, World Bank and IMF engagement across the region, the rapid deregulation in countries like Poland, not to mention Ukraine, that created some of the festering problems that we see here, including, as I discussed, the rapid expansion of NATO eastward. I think personally that and like I said, a lot of NATO members were not happy with the push that the United States made in 2008 to try to extend an offer of membership to Ukraine and Georgia, partly because they did not want to antagonize Putin, but also because they did not want Ukraine and Georgia. They did not think that they were ready to be members of NATO. And they did not think it would strengthen the alliance to bring those countries in. Yes, and you mentioned, and some of the commenters here have mentioned, other things that the United States have done that were provocative. And so, but I think to me though, then the other side in the conundrum is that I think there is a real problem that Vladimir Putin does not see those countries on the rim of Russia that they view as they use terms like the near abroad, the borderlands, that they do not see those countries as really having the right to operate as fully sovereign, independent countries. And that is a really difficult problem. And so I think that is, so I think some people have mentioned the problem in the United States of, lowering the rhetoric of the United States, but there is also the problem of how do you impact Vladimir Putin's behavior? When I think that if you look at Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, that where he is not happy with the direction that a neighboring country is going, he is happy to create these zones of chaos that destabilize and weaken that country even further. And I think that is as much, so we're Americans and we can impact, or most of us here are Americans, we can impact and put pressure on and vote for people who we think will do things that we would like to have done. But I think it is one of the biggest conundrums is how can the United States impact Putin's behavior? If there had not been NATO, people in Poland will say if there had not been or the Baltic states, if there had not been expansion to their countries of NATO and the EU, those countries would not be the relative, for all the problems that especially Poland has right now, they would not be the prosperous, sort of secure countries that they feel themselves to be. So, in criticizing the United States, which I am always happy to do, I think that we have to recognize that that there's a fundamental problem, I think, in how Vladimir Putin sees the world. Let's see, I'm trying to remember whose name was up next.
I would say Gary Gilson, maybe.
Okay, yeah, okay. Gary?
Yes, Dr. Curtin, how would you assess the performance of the mainstream American news media in informing the public about any of this?
So, we were talking about this a little bit in the chat room. I think that there is a tendency to, I don't really know the word to use. I think that the almost excitement about, war and, sending weapons and all that I find it frankly alarming. And and the emphasis on military actions, and we're sending javelins and we're doing this and we're doing that, and on the confrontation is, unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't go beyond that to think about the issues. I think that if you sit down and read some of the reporting, there's some really good and interesting reporting that is there. But I'm afraid that a lot of people in our media environment and reliance on social media don't get beyond that. So that's my thought.
Okay. Mariam Yusuf Sada. I'm sorry, Mariam. You had a
Thank
question?
you. Yes, I wanted to really understand Putin's need, because we can't solve the problem until we fully understand what does he really want. Is it that he wants to have the Soviet Union back, or does he want the economy of Ukraine and the economy of Poland and the economy of Belarus and economy of Georgia or whatever that they have? What is the real need here? What does he want?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I think that we can speculate. He has stated publicly many times that he thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union was, one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. He's used language that makes clear that he sees that Russian dominance of its space as as what he wants. And so I don't know what I don't know where that leaves us. I mean, it leaves us needing to, unfortunately, negotiate with him. But he has made very clear that his idea of a good world is one in which the contours of the former Soviet Union are in place, and Russia dominates that space. Let's see, we probably, yeah.
Dr. Curtin, I think maybe I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, and maybe there are others, and perhaps we'll stick around a little later. I see Richard Remnick has one. But so we're talking about the harsh sanctions on Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I think there could be unintended consequences. Like, I understand Russia controls the titanium in the world, for instance, as well as palladium. And of course, we know about the oil going to Germany. So couldn't this have some real unintended consequences on our well-being in the U.S. and the West?
Yeah. So, one of the ways that Russia had previously always controlled Ukraine was that there's so many pipelines that run from Russia through Ukraine to Europe, and he could just cut the oil off, at will. So one of the problems, I think, with a lot of sanctions regimes is that they try to punish the intended target without without us or the Europeans suffering too much from that. And so if there are sanctions that are put on Russia that really are harsh and that really do impact Russia in a meaningful way, then they are going to impact us and the Europeans for all the reasons that you say. So that, Europe is dependent on Russian oil and gas, and there's a lot of work being done to find alternative sources. But if really truly punishing sanctions were put on Russia, they would have a blowback, and so that's a problem.
Okay. Last question, Richard Remnick. You're muted.
I had a question about the press and this crisis. The question is, how long can it last before the American press and the American public gets fed up with it? And you know what might happen then? You know, actually, this crisis has brought together Republicans, many Republicans, not all, and Democrats in condemning Putin's behavior. But the Congress could, in time, push through some legislation which may precipitate a crisis by engaging in early sanctions before anything has happened. I mean, that would be a consequence of people losing patience with this. I mean, Putin has unlimited patience. You know, he can rotate military forces on the border at will. He can move in even when the ground turns soft at the end of April or, you know, late March. But the US, it seems to me, does have a problem, which is how much attention can we pay to this? And what would be the consequences, especially with the Congress?
I mean, I think that, you know, I think that's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer to that. You know, I think that is an issue though. So sort of the attention span. I mean, look at Afghanistan, you know, it has disappeared from the average person's thought process right now, to the extent it was even there. And and someone else mentioned, you know, we have elections coming up this year. Some Republicans have tried to make an issue out of it. I don't think it is something that a lot of people care about. And so, I mean, sometimes too much attention to an issue is not a good idea either. So, you know, it could be that, you know, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure where, you know, the American sort of public sphere is going to go on that. I know that, you know, very often, you know, sort of really intensive diplomacy continues even after, you know, sort of the flurry of attention to it. But you know, I think that it's really hard to predict with American domestic politics coming into play, how that is going to work. So.
Thank you, Dr. Curtin. This has been great. We will bring the meeting to a close, and I appreciate everyone being here. I omitted our co-sponsor, Global Minnesota, which we're always very happy to have as a co-sponsor and grateful for their good work that they do in our community of Minnesota with their robust programming. They do wonderful things. Again, we invite you to become a member of the United Nations Association. It's www.una.usa. I did post the poll results in the chat, so if you wish to save the chat, you can save it to your computer. Otherwise, I'll attach that as we send out things. The Global Engagement Summit on February 24th through the United Nations Association. Just go on to unausa.org. You'll see and be able to easily register for that. And I thank Dr. Mary Curtin for your wonderful presentation. I know we could spend a lot more time on it, but I also think that this has been really well done and it's very much appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you. And you're a great group. And I hope to talk to this group again sometime. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to leave this open for a few minutes to for those who want to maybe chat or say some things, and those that don't, please feel free to leave, and we appreciate you attending. Thank you.
Hi. I have one question, quick. I am a student at Concordia College in Moorhead, and I was wondering if there are any ways that myself and my classmates can be more involved with UNAUSA.
The answer is yes. You could start a college chapter.
Yeah.
And if you go to the UNA USA webpage, I don't know where that linkage is, but I think you'll find it. And they are very helpful in terms of setting up college chapters. And in fact, quite a lot of our membership is made up of college students, right? And so please pursue that. And if you don't get an answer, you'll have my email address and you can send me.
Stu,
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank
Jason, may I add? Yes, she can get help from UNA national staff. I'd be happy to help her. Secondly, our student, we are at 28,000 members nationally, and 2/3 are students.
Wow, that is amazing. I am really excited. Thank you so much.
And student memberships are free too.
Yes.
Yes, Mary, go ahead.
Hi, Stu. I'm Gigi's friend.
Oh, yes, I remember. Hi. Nice to see you.
And Gigi forwarded the link to me, and I was so grateful because this was really interesting. A couple of things, and I would have liked to have asked Mary Curtin about this, but I don't understand why it's so hard for Americans to understand the whole notion of spheres of influence. I mean, we go back to the Monroe Doctrine, you know, we didn't want other countries messing in our hemisphere. And my husband, Roy, taught international relations at Carleton, and he died in 2013. But even long before he died, he was very worried about, he said when the Soviet Union crumbled, Russia lost so much face. I mean, they'd had this huge empire, and then it was so vastly reduced. And he was talking many years ago about what he perceived as almost the danger of ringing Russia with its former satellite states so allied with the West, especially militarily in NATO. But and he used to put it in terms of you don't want to corner a tiger, that a cornered tiger is the one that's going to lash out and attack. And I wonder if, I mean, Keith Curtis raised the political question of, you know, well, could Americans accept the idea that if the US offered to commit to not letting the West invite Ukraine into NATO, would that go down politically? But I just wonder if there wouldn't be a way to reframe that such that it would be in our interest. I mean, we've got an angry cornered tiger, and that the way to defang the tiger is to step back a little bit. And I just wonder, would the political costs be so great? And especially given what Mary Curtin said about the fact that there's even concern about whether Ukraine and Georgia are even ready, that there's too much instability. So I don't really understand why we're almost making that a line in the sand saying, well, you know, we can't ever commit a sovereign nation to not doing X. But it seems to me we as Americans with the Monroe Doctrine should understand that.
Mm-hmm. Well said, right? Do you suppose that we're all wary of the Nazi expansion experience?
Mm.
This is a question. I don't have an answer for your thought, but
Stu, may I add something for a couple of minutes? You know, Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, and he really needed the United States to help him to move toward free enterprise and democracy. And for some years, he was getting along with us. At one time, Russia was thinking about joining the EU and NATO. But then a few things happened that alienated him. And I'm not saying the United States did that out of malice, but it may have been just bad policy, bad decisions, missteps, like Dr. Curtin said. We invaded Iraq, and that scared him. We invaded Iraq based on phony premises of weapons of mass destruction. Then we went and tried to put a pro-American Saakashvili as president of Georgia, and that scared him too. So he invaded Georgia. So the trust was broken. And in then 2014, we come and our State Department is caught telling on the phone who to put in power in Ukraine because we don't want Ukraine to be pro-Russia. So many things happened that alienated him and angered him. And now we are in a dangerous situation, but the cost of a long, protracted war is going to be a lot more than the cost of diplomacy. If I may say so, I think the United States should just get into discussion directly with Russia and say, okay, if you pull your troops away and make a promise not to invade Ukraine, we'll pull our military support off too for a while. It has to be a two-sided street. We can't have our cake and eat it too. We can't have Ukraine to be under our control with the protection of our weapons and military advisors and then tell Russia not to do that. What we do if Putin sent weapons and troops to Canada or Mexico, like you indicated, we need to look at this as what is the cost of the war and the damage to America's interests in the long run? How much money goes for weapons? Forget about killing people for a moment, which is tragic, but even the economic cost will be enormous. We are still paying for the Vietnam War in terms of borrowings and interests and all that. So that's my view.
I'll second that motion, and I think Leon and I always felt that beginning with the Eisenhower administration, the militaristic punch first before you get punched element in American culture really ran the foreign affairs more and more. I know so many diplomats who are what I consider real diplomats, who are in favor of working with the EU, but we always put that gun along with it. Mm-hmm. And after all, as Mary Louise Grohl just said, the Russians had good reason to be worried about us because of the way we behaved, the things we said, and we never looked at it from their point of view. We always look at everything as though somebody's about to bust us. That's my, and hello to all my old friends. I'm still here on my soapbox.
Well, stay there, Leela.
Good to see you.
Good place to be.
You know, there's absolutely no question that we have a massive defense industry and massive spending on armaments. And so there's an economic reason, it seems to me, that keeps some of these things going where they shouldn't be. It's $500 some million of weapons going into Ukraine every year from the US. Well, that's supporting our weapons industry. So that brings me back to the UN and the importance of peace and non-proliferation, you know, and that's really kind of at the core of it. And we get so messed up with all the rest of it, right? Big, tough United States, yes. And of course, big, tough Russia too. I mean, you know.
Well, I was going to say, Stu, this is Wayne Prochniak, right? I do understand all of what was just said, but we are not, as a nation, omnipotent, okay? No, divorces don't happen because of just one person. Divorces happen because of two people, right? And we cannot just completely impose our will, why don't we do it this way, on Russia or frankly any other nation. They all have their own self-interests. And as was said, I think we need to do a better job of understanding what their interest is and seeing where we can compromise on those things. We don't have that as a very sophisticated view in the US.
A question for you all. Do you think that President Biden and his foreign policy team understands this?
No. I don't think so. I think that most of them seem to have come from security and military attitude committees and departments. I don't see very many real diplomats, peacemakers. Put yourself in the other guy's position before you shout. People, at least the media is not telling us about any of those people.
Yeah, I think that's.
All we get is the big mouths.
Weaver?
Yeah, I think that you just hit on something there, that the media doesn't have time to spend on educating their readers or their viewers. Maybe, I watch Christiana Amanpour regularly, and when she devotes 20 minutes to one subject, it startles me that I learned so much, but that can't happen in the mainstream. So this education component, I think, falls on the shoulders of organizations like the United Nations. I'm not sure how you exercise that, somehow getting to the right press, the right reporters, and getting long, in-depth stories published frequently enough so that we actually do learn the other perspectives. I learned a whole lot listening in today, and I can only imagine how much more I would learn in another 3 or 4 hours, and how much more the general public would learn. So, wow, to me, that's the crux of it. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the Biden administration is doing a bad job at what they're doing, but they're not seeming to bother at all about educating us all.
I'm not a big believer in conspiracy, but I wonder how many of you wonder if all of this hullabaloo about Ukraine is an attempt, I'm not saying by the Biden administration, just an attempt to remove COVID from the front, from the top headline. Usually when I turn on NPR or read the Star Tribune or whatever, Ukraine is now the replacement headline to what is going on with COVID. And I'm just wondering if lots of individual media decisions are, people are tired of reading about COVID. Let's get something else on the above the fold for them to read. Does anybody else think that way?
Yeah, I think it's the presence of the Russian troops that has made the media turn their focus to that. But it is true. I'm sure people are tired of reporting about COVID.
The Dickinsons, somebody has a hand up there. Please go ahead.
I'm Catherine Guizon. I teach also at the U. I would like to say first, as a foreign-born scholar, how refreshing it has been to listen to you all and to hear the level of self-reflection. And I wish more people in Europe, especially where I have many connections, both personal and professional, would listen to you. So I would like to thank you for this evening. The second thing I would like to say is I have a post on the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center of the UN on the Russian-US relationship and on the peaceful dismantling of the Soviet Empire, partly through efforts of self-transformation within the Soviet Union. And this deserves to be known, it's factual. And you know, I think oppression within is linked to oppression without. We know this in this country, but it's happening right now in Russia. Some of you may have heard of the closing down of 2 major human rights centers, the memorials. And my post is also about this and about a dialogue I am organizing next fall on Russian civil society, if my Russian colleagues are still willing to participate. And I tried to alert the human rights milieu at the U, but I didn't have much success. So, and of course, people are tired. There are so many issues in so many countries. But in any case, I want to thank you and just indicate this post for your interest.
Where can we see the post?
So you go to Society Pages, Genocide and Holocaust Studies Center of the University of Minnesota. Okay, you can't miss it. And when you look, there are different topics. It appeared a week ago. Just Google, I suppose, what is it? Memorial closing. I can't remember the title even.
Or Guisan.
Yeah, Guisan, Guisan is my name, Catherine.
Perhaps you could put that in the chat, Catherine.
Okay, sure, I will.
Yeah. Any other comments? Longorias, you have anything you'd like to share? Sorry to put you on the spot. You're on mute.
There we go. Yes. What happens if in November we vote the GOP out and Putin has no friends in America?
Oh, but he will.
He doesn't need us. Real question. It's a real question. Because all of this, from our standpoint, looks here on our fellows on Botwell's Landing, it looks like a big bluff from Putin because America is so divided and not supportive of our president. So if in a few months we all say goodbye to the GOP, is then Putin going to have to rethink the whole game?
Interesting question. Food for thought. We might also ask why did
let me just reference is that if you look back at every time the United States of America has been seen as an adversary to somebody, the assumption is always made that we're a divided people. We can never be counted on to become a unified nation, and that our internal democratic process could be manipulated externally. And so we're looking at Putin getting everybody to wonder how we're being so unfair to poor Putin. And it's something that Putin, who has invested gazillions of rubles into figuring out how to understand us through the digital world. I mean, we're all talking in the language of the last century, but in the 21st century, at any moment, Putin can ask his computer people to assess where we stand on any political issue and whether we stand united against him. He can probably minute by minute track us in how we stand on whether we're going to send troops or we're going to use technology against him. I mean, it's just the 21st century.
Bharat, would you like to take us out with a final thought or question?
Well, I do have a couple thoughts. They take me back and they look way into the future. One thought is I celebrated when the Cold War ended. I was in that parade of people outside when Gorbachev visited us in St. Paul. And in fact, I was planning to take part. I'd just become a serious runner. And there was a group of us who were going to go to the marathon in Moscow, run in Moscow to celebrate all of that. So to me, that was exciting. But what I couldn't understand is I thought that more or less ended the role for NATO. I thought NATO was basically because of the Iron Curtain. And I would have thought that all the expenses and all the sort of military kind of engagement and all the drain that US has to put in to support NATO would all disappear. And that we would probably have an open society like Soros wanted to have, for example. And but it didn't happen. So that's a tragedy in my mind. Looking into the future, I kind of think, especially coming from Asia, even though I'm more here than in Asia, there's a real concern about the amazing way in which US and Western Europe and all facilitated China in becoming a great, great power. We gave everything to them. And the saddest part is 10 years before that, India tried so hard to get technologies and other areas for development, and US refused completely because we were not 100% capitalistic. We were like partly capitalistic and partly socialist, whereas China was all the other way, and we gave it all to them. Anyway, so the concern now is that into the future, I'm quite sure China would be the most prominent. It won't be Russia. Russia won't be the tiger. It'll be China. And I wouldn't be surprised if Russia and Russians in general feel much more empathy with Europeans, being part of the European than being kind of companions of the Chinese. Okay, I'm sorry to say that. I mean, we all should treat everybody equally, but some things are more equal than others. And so I would think that Russia will probably feel much better to be part of Europe. And I'm assuming by that time, I don't know how many years forward, but by that time, US probably won't be as prominent as it sees itself right now. And so Europe then will become the kind of the center, and Russia would love to be part of that community. And as such, a lot of the issues of future world would be, on one hand, the European continent, the other hand, the American, and then the third hand would be the Asia. And I'm hoping someday sense will come in and all of us will think the only way to get rid of war, get rid of armaments, get rid of all this unnecessary is to become one world. And basically, then we won't need any wars. There won't be any wars if we are all one nation. Ultimately, that's what has happened to us. We started as tribes, local tribes, and then a fiefdom, and then slowly got into nation states. So nation states are not permanent. They will dissolve. And I'm hoping that that's what will happen. And I hope these stories like the current situation in Ukraine and so on would be kind of basically footprints in the sand of the human civilization. That's my thought.
Thanks.
I think that's a wonderful way to wrap it up. And so thank you very much. Do save the chat. I just put a very interesting side presentation that I heard today from a fellow by the name of Duncan McCampbell on is China at its zenith? And it gives both sides of that story. And we appreciate your coming very much in this exchange. And thank you, and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you, Stu.
Bye-bye. Great to see you all.
That's a great article, Stu. I already looked at it.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
Just a 16-page outline with the maps and charts. It's so clear thinking.
Right. Well, he's writing a book, and this is out of his book. And he made a
Yeah.
presentation to my breakfast club this morning. He was
Yeah.
very, very interesting on it all.
Very clear thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you all. Have a good night.
Night.